Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Rancher Online Meetup. We're going to be talking about managing workloads on Kubernetes with Rancher 2.0. We're really excited to have so many people here today. Looks like we have, as usual, a really enormous audience. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Just as a way of introduction, I'm Shannon Williams. I'm one of the founders here at Rancher and run our sales and marketing side of the business. And Darren Shepard is with me, my co-founder. Darren, you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone out there.
Darren is the chief architect here at Rancher and has been working hard on Rancher 2.0 the last few months. So we decided to show it to you. If you guys want to reach out to either of us, we're both on Twitter and on there at least somewhat regularly. So you can find us there. You're also welcome to reach out to us, directly at our Rancher email addresses, which are just, Shannon at Rancher or Darren at Rancher.com. But we have a great session today for you. For those of you who don't know, these events that we do, we've been doing them now for more than 2 years. They are, we try to do one every month. Sometimes we go a couple months between them. But the whole idea of them is we create an open online version of the meetups that we participate in locally and all over the world that are meant to be places where people can come and talk and communicate. So this is a meetup. It's not a webinar. We don't pre-record anything. We don't have any of the same constraints. In fact, if you think about this as a meetup, you'll be in good standing, because we don't set a really aggressive time target for this. We almost never get them done in an hour. So I warn you ahead of time, we won't be done on time. We try to get through the main topic relatively quickly, but there's almost always lots of questions. We are known for taking lots of questions. So if you have questions, please fire them away at any time. We take the questions using the questions tab over on the right-hand side of your screen. So you should see the questions pane, and it looks like people are already asking them. And hopefully, we'll be talking, already getting people asking for specific things right now. So the big thing you need to know, we demo live, so things will break, and be patient if they do. So Darren will be going through a number of demos today. Very often, at least one of them will have some problem or some network or something we didn't anticipate going wrong. So we try to have things sort of backups if possible, but bear with us if something's not loading. There's usually lots of questions. So we do try to drive the conversation onto the, out into social networks. So if you want to chat with other people who are attending, we have a hashtag for Twitter that you can use called Rancher Meetup. You just put that in there and post a picture of you're participating in this meetup, and I will slap it up here. Just join the community, show us what you're doing, where you live, who you're with, why you care, why you're interested in this topic. Don't hesitate. If you've got questions afterwards, I try to monitor that Rancher meetup for the next day or so pretty vigilantly. So feel free to tap them in there, and I'll take a look at them. We also have the Rancher Slack channel, which is slack.rancher.io. You're welcome to join in there, and you can chat with other people that are part of the Rancher community on that front. So our agenda for today is pretty aggressive, as usual. We're going to be going through and talking about the new Rancher beta release that came out last week. I'll be providing a bit of an overview on what what we were thinking as we built it and what the design was for the product. Then we're just going to dive in and start showing you what it can do. We're going to talk through, in the first demo, Darren will just kind of relatively quickly go over provisioning clusters. We covered this quite a bit in our last meetup. It's changed some, between the last tech preview and beta. So we wanted to just spend a few minutes just talking through what's different, how to use custom hosts, how to use some of the cloud hosted providers. And then we'll dive in more detail into managing workloads, using the UI, kind of understanding how to use Kubernetes for some of you who are maybe cattle users and want to try to understand what's similar, what's different. We'll talk through a little bit of that. Then we'll wrap up talking about some new things that are just in the beta around configuring alerts, doing piping your logs out from your container deployments, using some of the new pipeline stuff. Then I'll I'll wrap us up. We'll go through a little bit of kind of the upcoming releases and some of the plans, and hopefully we'll have answered all of your questions. Though I know that's almost never possible. So that's the agenda, and looking forward to all of these demos. I know Darren was working on them for quite some time. So Rancher 2.0 is now in beta. This is a project we've been working on for 9 months since we started and announced that we were building, kind of this new direction and where it was going. It's been an awesome experience. So many of you have participated. I know from the beginning, helping us with ideas, with thoughts, with comments. And we've learned a lot as we went through. We've made some adjustments. But as we're getting towards the finish line on this, we really are excited about what the product is looking like and some of the exciting things we want to work on, going forward. The idea behind Rancher 2.0 was really to imagine the next generation of containers and container management platforms. Rancher really was the first company out there to build a multi-tenant, multi-cluster management platform for clusters and containers back in 2016 when we launched Rancher 1.0. And with 2.0, we really wanted to imagine where this is going and build for the next wave. And we're really excited about this product because it really layers in three exciting things. One is the kind of the standardization that's happened in containers. We've moved from a point where 2 years ago it was very unclear how we would be orchestrating and deploying and using our containers and what tools we'd be using around them to now an era where we're seeing standardization from across the industries. People are all using Docker. They're more and more using Kubernetes. We're seeing consistency around tools like Prometheus as people look for ways to monitor their workload. So as industry is kind of standardized, it's allowed us to really build out support for an era where we believe Kubernetes is going to be everywhere, where users will have clusters they've built. They'll have clusters that are run by cloud providers, and and they'll need to take these clusters and consistently manage them and make sure that they meet whatever policies they need around security, but also provide a consistent user experience on it. At the end of the day, the reason I think so many of us are excited about containers is that they have given us a way to deploy applications and software consistently without doing a ton of config to boxes to try and sort of normalize the underpinning layer. They've allowed us instead to just say, here, I've got my workload right. I know it'll run and go and put it out there. And with a standard orchestration engine now emerging around Kubernetes and large providers like AWS and Google and Azure supporting it, it really means that you can very confidently expect to be able to not only deploy your application, but to provide all of the instructions for how to run your application consistently wherever you run it. And so at Rancher, we've really built, again, the first time someone's tried to do this, we've built a management platform that's open source that provides a continuous, consistent control plane and management plane for all of your clusters, whether we deployed them using Rancher's distros of Kubernetes, or they come from the cloud, or someone else built them. And that layer of provisioning is important, and how you build clusters is always something that our users care about. But the reality is, that is going to become more and more a standard. It's going to become easier and easier. There's already lots of good ways to stand up a Kubernetes cluster. It's not that hard anymore. So really, we've kind of moved on to solving some of the other really difficult problems in addition to that, which is, how do you manage users across all of these? How do you manage policy across them? How do you, kind of define how people should interface with these clusters? And so we kind of see two layers of challenge. One is the management piece where policy gets implemented and you define, as maybe more of an IT org or as an operational team, how you want clusters to be used. And then another layer where there's some really rapid innovation happening, and that is what I can do on top of Kubernetes. What can I do around Docker? And how do I actually operate this successfully? And there, we're just starting to build this out, but you can imagine, not only providing good ways to deploy applications and rich catalogs like Helm, but also a broad set of tools from kind of typical operational functions like monitoring your application, APM, log management, troubleshooting, CI/CD, but also kind of next generation things like service mesh or data services that are managed centrally and easily deployed. So there's a lot of innovation happening there, a lot happening on the storage side, a lot happening on the networking side. So we're really excited. We think that this platform gives us a lot of room to build for the foreseeable future. And so if you think about Rancher, we're going to cover each of these sections in the demos today, but really at the core, what makes it very unique is Rancher allows you to manage all of your clusters continuously. You can deploy Rancher itself anywhere. So you can, set up, we have our own distro of Kubernetes that's very easy to deploy. You can just use that using RKE, which we talked about in the past, or obviously Rancher sets that all up for you using node drivers or using our custom host import. And in any of those ways, you can set up a really good, highly available cluster of Kubernetes that Darren will walk you through. But you can also, from Rancher, launch, into the cloud. I can go in today and use my Google credentials and spin up a GKE, fully implemented cluster in Google, and manage the resources, scale the nodes, apply policy to that clusters, and you can do the same thing with a cluster that maybe someone's already built. So lots of different ways to get Kubernetes and to build your kind of cluster list, because once you've done that and you've deployed these clusters, you're now able to start applying policy. And the first one, the most obvious one, is managing users. So Darren will talk probably briefly about how to connect to your directory services, how to connect to GitHub, or how to use local auth to create a set of users that are authorized to access the system. But from there, then you need to be able to build your RBAC policies. And Rancher has a bunch that are pre-built, but you're also going to have the ability to create new roles that are very granular with very detailed controls and apply those. And we're leveraging all of the functionality in Kubernetes and then applying that directly to the clusters or to namespaces or to any layer of access, so that you can give really self-service experience to the developers or the users or the DevOps teams that are trying to deploy applications. And that same approach is what we're taking to other types of security policies. So you can see pod security policies is the first one we fully implemented. But you can imagine other things here as well, like image security policies or network security policies that can be centrally defined and applied then to to all of your different workspaces, clusters, environments, and namespaces. Finally, the last bit we're going to really get into is the actual running of the containers. I think what have always, if you go and talk to lots of Rancher users, what they'll tell you about 1.6 and the current experience is very often what they love the most about Rancher is how it implemented, a really great UI and UX for people to understand what all the options were for deploying and running containers, things that they may not have known were available, or options for how to make their workloads more resilient or run it in a slightly better way. And so we've really brought that same experience with us onto Kubernetes. We've implemented a full user interface around it. We've implemented an integrated app catalog. You'll see a whole bunch of new logging and alerts and pipelines and other technology that we think will help people consume this better, whether that's setting up ingress policies or creating volumes or mounting external storage services. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. And by doing all this as an open source project, like with Rancher 1.0, we expect, for thousands of organizations, this to be the way people learn how to use and consume all the awesome stuff that's in Kubernetes as an engine. So these are the areas we're going to talk about. I know there's lots of questions, and so I'll start answering them as I turn this over to Darren. But I really wanted to to thank you all for coming today and kind of working with us on this journey. It's been an awesome few months as we've been working on 2.0. You can see we've made hundreds of releases and 3 or 4 really major tech previews and alpha releases. We're now in beta. We sort of finished a lot of the things we were looking to complete, like volume support and workload management, and the monitoring and logging and secret management that are in the product. We're really now predominantly working on stability. We're just fixing bugs. We're hoping to GA, in the next month or two. We've got a lot of work to do there, but we're not really making major changes to the platform anymore. So while stability is still something that's got a room for improvement, we're working on, for the most part, your experience in Rancher today is going to be the same as when we GA the product. We are working already on 2.1 a bit. 2.1 is sort of the next feature release. That's going to be primarily focused on on the migration of users from 1.6 to 2.0. So providing a pathway for how to take applications that were deployed on 1.6 and easily move them over to 2.0. We're working through some of that now. You'll see a lot more information on that in the next month or two. That'll probably be, if not our next meetup, maybe the meetup after that. We'll be diving into a lot about migration. But there's a few other big things we're already working on for 2.1, like extending the CI that's in the 2.0 to target continuous delivery. We'll talk more about expanded monitoring with Prometheus beyond some of the alerting we're doing now. So a lot of cool stuff that we're working on. These are sort of the more firmed up things. There's a lot of things we're still discussing, but it should go well for people who are running 1.6. I know a lot of people attend this or are our users today. You shouldn't feel any pressure to move to 2.0. 1.6 will continue to be supported for the foreseeable future. I'm sure it'll be at least a year from when we release 2.1 before we start really pushing people to try and migrate, and kind of encouraging them to get off 1.6. So consider, just stay, feel free to pay attention to this and work with it, but don't feel a ton of pressure. We're still doing a lot of fixes, and there's still 1.6 releases coming all the time with improvements and bug fixes. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Darren. Darren's going to dive into, to begin with, provisioning clusters. So Darren, I'm gonna make you the presenter.
All right.
Okay, you should have the ball.
All right. So you should be able to see my desktop.
I see a unhappy Chrome window.
Well, yep, that's my desktop. Okay, so I'm going to run through provisioning. So the last meetup we did, we went pretty heavily into provisioning and RBAC and security and kind of managing policies and stuff like that. We're probably not going to get very heavily into the policy stuff, or kind of cover that in the last meetup. Not a lot has changed there. Provisioning, we have made quite a bit of changes to it. So I wanted to quickly go through. So I'm not going to go kind of in depth, but I just want to show you kind of some of the changes that we've done in the provisioning workflow and what are the features being added and whatnot. So launching the Rancher server is basically it's the same way it's been for a couple of releases now. You just expose ports 80 and 443. The version I'm going to be running right now is 2.0.0 beta 3 RC1. We announced beta a couple weeks back. We're going to GA in a month or so. The way it is right now is we're just kind of releasing things. Like we fix a couple bugs, we'll put out another beta release. We'll fix a couple bugs. So it's not a specific cadence, and it's just kind of as we're fixing things. So there's some critical bugs we found. So beta 3 will probably be coming out today or tomorrow. But for this demo, I'm going to be running RC1. Oh wait, hold on. I'm going to put that in the background. Oops. Okay. Docker PS. Okay, let me launch this in the background. Okay, so I'm just launching this for the first time. It does take maybe 30-40 seconds to come up the first time. After that, it's going to be real fast. But the very first time, it has to initialize a bunch of data. That's actually what's going on. So we'll just give it a second while it's coming up. I think one of the questions, since we launched beta, I think like the number one question we get right now is what's the HA setup? And so what I'm showing you right now is just kind of the simple single Docker container. Everything's running in the container. It's very similar to 1.6. We're running, our persistent database in the same container, which is etcd now. So everything's just running in one container. It's super simple to get up and running. You can actually, you can stick with this approach if you don't care about HA. Upgrades are very simple. You just use Docker. You either just bind mount varlib rancher to persist that directory, or use volumes from to do the upgrades. But so for HA, let's make sure this came up. Okay. I'll talk about it in just a second. Let me finish kind of what I was saying about HA. So HA is a, we have it basically there, but we are still kind of packaging it. So the way that HA works for Rancher Server is Rancher Server is really, in fact, just an application that runs on top of Kubernetes. So the way you do an HA setup is you have to deploy Rancher Server in a Kubernetes cluster, which sounds a little bit like an inception because you're deploying a cluster management product inside of an existing cluster. But the way that we do that is we actually just use RKE, which is our standalone container or standalone Kubernetes distribution and installer. And so what we're doing is we're packaging up RKE with Rancher Server, so you can just very easily point to 3 servers, and it will set up those like 3 servers as a tiny Kubernetes cluster running Rancher Server, and then it'll be fully HA. So that's actually what I'm working on over the next week or so we can get HA out there. But it should be a pretty simple setup, not too. It won't be too much more difficult than the way 1.6 is, but we're planning to kind of increase the scope to include more because it has like SSL configuration, bootstrapping some of the authentication. Because today, if you were to try to install 1.6 like fully from scratch, you have to automate like setting up GitHub and AD and all that stuff actually takes quite a bit. And so we're kind of bundling that all into the installer. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be more questions about HA, but the answer is, we actually do technically have it working, but we're still packaging it up and getting it out to users. So Rancher Server, we now run 100% SSL. There's no option to not run SSL. Like we need SSL. It's good for security, but just in general, Kubernetes just doesn't work well if you're not running SSL. So when you run Rancher Server by default, we're just going to give you a self-signed certificate. That's why we're going to get this. Your connection is not private. We have instructions for bringing your own certificate, so you can just set up your own certificate. There's a lot of different options here. You can run SSL termination in front of Rancher Server. We have native support for Let's Encrypt. So there's a lot of different options to set up proper SSL. And then this will all be pretty easily baked into the HA setup too. Oops. Okay, so when we come in, we just need to set up a password. Oops. And then the Rancher Server URL. This is very important, and part of the setup is you don't really want to get this one wrong. This URL needs to be reachable from the nodes because the nodes will call back to the Rancher Server in order for us to get access to like kubectl. And there's a various different things where we need to talk to the nodes. And so instead of Rancher Server reaching out to the nodes reach back to us, which for most people works better in a firewall situation for their like firewalling. But this is not actually a critical part of the kind of control plane. Like if the nodes can't reach back to Rancher Server, like certain things in the UI just don't work. Like your deployments and everything will work fine. It's just certain things in the UI won't work. Okay, so let's set that up. Okay, so I wanted to go through some of the changes in the provisioning workflow. So we simplified this. In our last meetup, there was a couple more options. There was like custom or a cloud version. We kind of simplified everything into one. You're given this one dialog of what style cloud you want to deploy. What style Kubernetes cluster you want to deploy. So up here, we have the 3 major container services. So we have Container Engine. So, this is Google. We have Azure. And we actually have support for EKS, although EKS is not public yet. So, I'm not exactly sure when that's going to be announced, but when that's announced, you'll know that we will basically have support for it on day 1. So these are, for these 3 options here, you're getting a cloud managed Kubernetes distribution. It's their Kubernetes. They manage the hosts. If a host goes away, then the cloud will do something for it. So it's all basically managed. Like upgrades are pretty much managed or rolled out through the cloud. Like we'll tell you what version, if there's a new version available, you can click to say upgrade, but the upgrade is in fact actually done by the cloud provider, not us. Now over here, these options are running on just standard virtual machines in the cloud, and we use RKE to then deploy our distribution. So for various reasons, like today, if you want to run Kubernetes in Amazon, you're going to have to bring your own distribution. So the Amazon EC2 option makes sense. When EKS is available, then it's kind of, do you want to, it's kind of what level of visibility and control and whatnot do you want to have? Do you want everything managed by Amazon? Do you just want to get the virtual machines and get the distribution from us? There's a lot of different choices there. And so we have the same thing here with Azure and DigitalOcean and vSphere. So like for these 4 options, and you can add more. You can add more drivers for. There's a lot of different clouds. All the clouds that we supported in 1.6 are supported in 2.0. But these are all deploying Rancher's RKE distribution. Then the last 2 options are custom and import. Custom was like after we did the last meetup was the #1 requested feature by far, and this is what we already had in 1.6. And basically, the way a custom works, it's pretty much the exact same flow of what you would do in Rancher 1.6, which is if I'm creating a custom cluster. So I just go here, I can set some of the cluster options, like what version of Docker. This is important because a lot of times people run in unsupported versions. A lot of times you want to check that. Which version of Kubernetes do you want to run? If you're doing an ingress provider, networking. So once I set that up, so that gives me, that's configured the cluster, then I just need to go onto a host and then just copy and run this command. And so this will run an agent. This will run the agent on the host, which then checks into Rancher server, and then we'll start provisioning Kubernetes. Now, when you do this, there's something important to recognize down here, that these options of what type of node do you want this to be? Do you want it to be a worker? Do you want it to be a control plane? Do you want it to be etcd? You can do any combination that you want. But for a cluster to be fully available, like to fully provision, we need all 3 types of these. We need etcd, we need a control plane, we need some workers. So a very common mistake that people do is they just deploy workers, and then the provisioning will just sit there and say, I'm waiting for an etcd server. Okay, so yeah, actually it's right here. So it's waiting for etcd and control plane nodes to be registered. Okay, so let's actually deploy some. I'm gonna deploy both a Google container engine because I want to demo some things with storage through them, and then I'm gonna deploy a DigitalOcean one. So we can actually just start with the Google container engine. Here you can set up some of the privileges right up front if you want to, but right now I'm just gonna leave everything default. So you need this service account. There's instructions, some, I already got past that screen, but there's a little bit of instructions of basically what you need. You have to go to Google, go to their IM and add like 2 or 3 roles, and then that will give you a service account. So here I'm just going to go and I'm going to create a 3-node cluster in this zone with a G1 small with 100 gigs of disk. Okay, so that's basically it. Oops, I didn't name that. Let me just edit it and call that my GKE cluster. Okay, so let's go back. So that's provisioning. That's going to take a couple minutes. It takes maybe like 5 or 10 minutes. If I go over to GKE now, I can actually refresh, and you'll see that there's a cluster provisioning there. So now I want to go to the DigitalOcean. So we've added quite a bit on how you manage these custom, the ones that are cloud-based RKE installations. We've added this concept of basically we have a concept of node pools and node templates. So in order to deploy a VM, you need to create a node template. So if I go here and say, okay, let me create a node template. Okay, so this is a template. just select some random thing. So it's 8 gigabytes. I want this in San Francisco. It's going to be Ubuntu. So I'll say this is my 8 gigabyte VM. Okay, so that went and created this template. So now when I go and deploy, so here I can say I'm going to deploy these machines. This is going to be my control plane nodes. I'll just call them CP. So these ones I want to be etcd and control plane, and I want 3 of these. So now it's going to use this template. It's going to deploy 3 of these nodes. But I also, I need some workers. So I can add a second node pool here. Let's see, I'll add another template. We'll just go with, oops. Let's say the workers, we'll run the workers a little smaller or something. I'm just picking random sizes. And we'll call this the 4 GB nodes. And let's say, okay, now I want workers, and I'm going to do, let's say, 5 of these. So when I go and say create now, oops, I forgot to name it again. I always forget to name the clusters. Dio. Okay, so when I go into, let's see, my GKE cluster, that's fully up now. I can see the nodes and stuff like that. I'll come back to that. But so now when we go to the DO, you can see there's quite a bit going on the screen here. A lot of red, because basically it says a cluster's provisioning. Right now we're waiting for the nodes to be registered. You can see all the components are failing, all the hosts are bad, because basically everything's coming up. So we can go in here and click on nodes, and you can see the status of what's going on. So this one, these machines are provisioning. These are provisioning. Right now, we only do 5 at a time. We're going to bump that up, so we'll do like, I don't know, 100 at a time or something like that. It doesn't really matter, but it is like right now it does it in batches of 5. But so right now it's provisioning those VMs. So what will happen is the control plane comes up first. We provision the control plane. Once control planes, that's all healthy, then we start adding in the workers, and then then everything will come up. So this will take a couple minutes. I'll come back to this one as soon as that's done. What I wanted to point out just while we're waiting for this to come up was we did add features around. We did add. Sorry, if I go up to the global here and go to security. So one of the big things that we've been missing so far in our things was like proper integrated authentication. So we now have GitHub and Active Directory. So it's basically the same setup you had before in 1.6. We're just bringing those all back. So we'll have more coming here, SAML and LDAP. Although Active Directory, I think this one is it's pretty much it's the AD based one. It's not the Azure REST based one. So we do have support for these. So you can now set up GitHub or AD or whatever, and we'll continue. I'm not sure how many providers we'll have by the time we GA, but there's a couple more coming. Okay. Let me go back. Okay, so while this is still provisioning, because it still will take, like this VM is finally up, but we have to wait for all of these to be up. But there's a couple things I wanted to point out kind of in the UI here. So it's like I have these nodes. So now I can very easily, if I want to, I can just spin up, like just click plus or minus. I can just add another node. I don't have to put in credentials or anything. That's all saved in the Rancher server. It will you can just automatically spin them up and down. And so if I go and I delete one of these VMs, we'll actually replace it unless you scale it down. So like we'll ensure that there's always 5 of them. So let me go back to the GKE one. So, oops. So GKE, this one we don't have like the node pool integration, but it's a very similar thing. This is just I keep having to enter the credentials because right now we're not persisting them, but we probably will. the node count, if I wanted to, I can just change this node count, and then it will deploy, it will change the actual underlying Kubernetes. So you can, from our UI, you can scale up and down the clusters if you want. And you can also, if there's a new version, like right now, let's see, I think that's the only version available at the moment. Like I'm trying to think, maybe they don't have 1.9. If there was other versions available, then you could select it, and then you can upgrade. So let's see. Okay, so now it's actually, you'll see at the top here, this is where it actually starts doing the Kubernetes deployment. So again, this will take a couple minutes because we got to download all the images and everything. So I think at this point, I could probably answer some questions while we're just waiting for this to come up.
Sounds good, Darren. Lots of questions have been coming in. As always, I've been trying to answer some of them. Let me see if I can I'll give you a couple. One question came in from Leonardo. He said, in AWS, is it possible to create a Kubernetes cluster using part reserved instances, part spot instances? Any thoughts on that?
Well, so we have, I mean, it's definitely possible. Let me see if we have support, because there's always there's the option of just doing custom. So you can always just do custom, and then you just you put into your cloud config on boot, just run this Docker command, and then it'll register. And then so you can do whatever configuration you want. So that is feasible. But I'm curious. Let's see for like this. Let me pull open. I wonder if we have native. I'm not sure if we have like native support in the UI for it. So we'll just see. Select a subhead. Select a security group. Instance options. Yeah, so these are the options that we have currently in the UIs. Basically, we can do a spot instance, and you can do the price. But there is nothing, it looks like, for reserved if you already have reserved. So for the reserved one, you might have to go with the custom approach. So the only difference between to be honest, what we see that the vast majority of users use the custom approach because it integrates the best with whatever you kind of existing have. So this works really well. A lot of people use like Terraform and autoscaling groups to manage their clusters. So you just basically need to get that one Docker command, this command here, and then just on boot run that, and then it'll register in, and then it gives you just a huge amount of flexibility.
And a couple more questions, Darren. One question was how would you handle auto scaling of the cluster? Troy asked. He said, it seems like it'd be nice to be able to scale your clusters as things need more and more scale, and scale it back down as it doesn't need it anymore. So, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how people do that today, and what some of the different options are for auto scaling?
Yeah. So, Kubernetes has some built-in support for it if you do like the cloud integration. So it can work. It works well in GKE, and then it can work in AWS if you do the cloud provider, the AWS cloud provider. So there's the built-in Kubernetes options for that. So that's I think I'm gonna get the name wrong. It's like there's like a node autoscaler add-on for Kubernetes, and then besides that, you can also just use if you do if you do our custom approach with auto scaling groups, you can just use the scaling capabilities that are in AWS through CloudWatch and their metrics and everything. So you just scale up the auto scaling group, and then it'll create a host and it'll register it with Rancher. When you delete the host, we'll still keep a record of the host. Like you have to still go in and delete it from our UI to forget it, but it's not being used anymore. Even though today we don't clean up the hosts that disappear. Even though pods will be migrated off, they won't be running on there. Kubernetes will do all the right things, but I don't think we won't forget it for like days or something. It's whatever I kind of like the default is in Kubernetes.
So a couple more questions. Tell me when you're ready to sort of go on. But one of the questions, there was a couple questions about kind of different cloud or different implementations and distros of Kubernetes, and like, hey, can I import from a SUSE or from a canonical distro? The answer is yes. You can really import anything, but
yeah,
maybe you can just talk a little bit about kind of the concept of importing versus creating a cluster, and what the advantage of a created cluster is versus an imported cluster.
Yeah, so we have all these, we're really trying to cater to, however you can get your Kubernetes and you like your Kubernetes, we can get it to work. So there is the option of import. So if I can just go and I say, okay, I'm going to create this imported cluster, and then what you do is you just run this command, and then what this does is it will deploy our cluster agent inside of your cluster, which then calls back to Rancher server, sets up the credentials, and then we'll register it. And so this will work with pretty much any Kubernetes Kubernetes cluster. I mean, we do have some issue, like there's one caveat right now that you need to have the RBAC default, like the RBAC default roles and role bindings, which most distributions have, but some for some odd reason don't. That should be fixed by GA. But pretty much any sane Kubernetes one should work. Now, the difference between an imported and like one that we're managing or we have integration with the cloud is we have more ability to like basically manage the nodes. Like we can scale up and down, add, delete. We can do upgrades. So we have a little bit more interaction because we know what that cluster is and how the software was deployed. And so we can interact with basically either we're the one providing Kubernetes or it's coming from a cloud and we're integrating with that cloud. So you have more options there. If you just import, then basically we're going to show the nodes, but you can't do anything with them. You can't add, delete, upgrade, any of those type of maintenance things. Okay. Let me go back to this did finally. So this did, you can see, so basically the control plane is up. Some of the nodes are still registering. When they're registering, a lot of times they'll go to this red here. That's basically, they register in, and then the networking has to initialize. So it takes a little bit for the red to initialize. But this should all end up being, they'll all check in and be green in probably in a minute or so.
Lots of different questions, Darren. But why don't we, if you're ready to kind of keep moving, I'll keep answering them online, and we'll try to answer some more in a bit.
Sure. Okay, so I think we're just waiting for those two to. Right now, I'll tell you that our Kubernetes image is quite fat. Like we're gonna what you're showing, like the amount of time that it took to provision this cluster is actually like 90% of the time is pulling images. So that's actually what we're working on to kind of speed up, lighten the images quite a bit because they're really quite bloated. So that's actually so the reason why like this one here where it says like it's waiting to register, what it's doing, I know just behind the scenes, is it's pulling the Kubernetes image, which is currently 1.8 gigabytes, which we will fix that. Something that drives me nuts. But anyways,
Darren,
okay.
Any recommendation for an OS? There's a lot of questions about will it run on this, that, or the other. But Adrian said, do you recommend Ubuntu, Rancher OS? Like, what do you recommend?
I mean, it's kind of the same stuff as 1.6, which is, the Ubuntu always works well. Like a good modern Ubuntu always works well. And then Red Hat should work, but if you get too old with Red Hat, then you start running into weird issues. It really comes down to the Docker version. That's the biggest thing. So Kubernetes is pretty conservative on what versions of Docker that they support. So I think 1703 is the latest one right now. Pretty sure that's the latest one that they support. We actually have some bugs with Rancher OS right now that are being resolved. So Rancher OS is actually not a good option at the moment, unfortunately, but just because of some bugs we ran into. But we're resolving that. So right now, your best bet is Ubuntu. That's the one that's always basically worked, and it's just because it has the most amount of like open source users. But then from our enterprise customers, we always support RHEL, and so we do everything to make that work. But it's just sometimes it's a little more of a bumpy experience for open source users. Okay, let me go on. I'm not exactly sure why this node isn't checking in. Maybe it's super slow, or I don't know. But we've got other nodes, so we'll just continue forward. So once you have, basically, once we have the cluster provisioned, I mean, some of the things I don't think we had these before. Is like basically, so now we have integrated kubectl. So here I should be able to run like git node. So I can see, here's all my nodes that are registered, and yeah, because that one is still not coming in. Yeah, who knows? We can look at that later. So we have the integrated kubectl. So now when you do this, because everything that we have in Rancher here is we have authentication on, we have RBAC on, it's multi-user. Authentication is tied to, if I turned on GitHub, it's tied to GitHub. So when I log in, I'm a specific user and I have a certain RBAC policy and I can do certain things. So like when you launch this kubectl shell, like you're acting as yourself. So you can only do whatever you have access to. Like right now I'm a cluster owner or admin, so I can do anything. But if I was to add a regular user, like if I was to add them to a project, for example, and not make them a member of the cluster, they wouldn't be able to see cluster. They wouldn't be able to say nodes. Like, so they would say get nodes, and they would just get a permission denied. So we have the launch kubectl, and then we had this before. Basically you can get the kube config. So just like a reminder, whatever, how the authentication and authorization works in Rancher is we work as basically an authentication proxy for Kubernetes. So it doesn't matter where you're deployed, what type of authentication the cluster has set up. We basically act as a proxy that when you hit, this kube config, you can see it's hitting this Rancher server. Like it's not going to GKE or it's not going to DigitalOcean. It hits the Rancher server, it gets authenticated, and then we proxy the request to Kubernetes. So we use an impersonation basically to do that. And so everything for the external users and using this is we act as an authentication proxy. So this, basically what this allows us to do is we can add, whatever style of authentication, and it's consistent, whether it's on premise, it's on cloud, or whatever. Because you will notice that one of the biggest differences you're going to find between the cloud managed distributions is actually authentication and authorization. All of the clouds are doing a pretty heavy tie-in with their IAM. So they're expecting you to basically go through like Google IAM or AWS IAM or Azure to, add users, configure the whatever, the RBAC policies and stuff like that. But so with Rancher, we just give you one consistent approach for all that. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, so I'm going to get into basically managing workloads. So before I got into managing workloads, I want to talk a little bit about storage, because we've added storage, and just show you some of the things there. Because from kind of a navigation perspective, we have clusters, and then we have projects. Projects is basically just a group of namespaces. That's how we manage the policy for a group of namespaces. So you don't have to basically say like, set up the RBAC policy for this namespace, and then a user comes in and wants a new namespace, then you have to set up the RBAC policy for another namespace. So we just do everything based off of a project. You assign it to a project, and then you create namespaces. So it's a way of managing the policy. That's basically what the projects are. But sorry, that was a little tangent. Let me get back to the storage. So I want to show GKE, because GKE, it's any of the cloud-based ones, they come with a storage class kind of working out of the box. So it makes it quite nice. So basically at the cluster level, this is like more of an administrator type thing. At the cluster level, you have storage classes and persistent volumes. And so we've added support so you can go in here and say, okay, this is my GKE cluster. It actually already has a storage class for Google Persistent Disk. This is the default one, and it's called standard. So if a user was going and they were to create a volume, it's going to use this storage class by default because it's just marked as the default. But I can go and add more. So here, I can say, okay, well, actually, I want to set up an SSD class, and I specifically want it in this zone. And then there's some other advanced options around mounting and cleanup and whatnot. But so you could set up a different class, and you can call this one, okay, SSD. So now the users, they can go in and say when they create volumes, and I'll show you the volume stuff when we get into the workload management. You can say, okay, if you don't specify anything, you get standard by default. If you do specify which class, then you can say like, oh, I want SSD or standard. Also at this global level, we can see all of the persistent volumes that have been created across the cluster. So right now we don't have any. I'll show you in a little bit. But I kind of wanted to point this out before I got into the workload stuff of because this is more kind of cluster management, setting up the storage. So if you had something like you wanted to do NFS or iSCSI or whatever, you would be going in and configuring. So there's various different things. Even Longhorn, our storage solution. But so if you're doing VMware, you probably have a vSphere volume or there's custom, which is basically whatever this ends up being like, because you can get a custom storage class, and whoever you're getting that storage class from or the provider of the storage, they'll tell you what are the parameters that need to be put in, but you can just add any type of storage class in here. Okay, so I'm going to go in and go through the workload stuff, but let me talk a little bit about the projects so you just kind of understand what's going on here. So projects is a concept that's specific to us.
Darren, before you move on from storage, sure. There was a couple of questions about storage. Lori said, what about EFS? If I'm in Amazon, I think Prasad said, what PV provisioners does VMware have? Do you have, and I think Dominic said, do you have plans for support for the NetApp Trident storage plugin? There's a whole bunch of questions like this. So there's a broad set of storage that's supported in Kubernetes, and then there's sort of what Rancher kind of simplifies and makes easy. Maybe you can just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So basically, kind of what we have is, so what we added in the UI here is basically these are all of the kind of knowns. I think these are all the built-in ones. Like these are the storage classes that they don't require another provisioner to be deployed. So that's all the built-in ones. But going forward is everything is basically external. So there's if you look in, let's see, GitHub. I don't know if it's an incubator or if it's, so there's the external storage. It's probably an incubator. Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of different external storage providers, plus there's more that are not in here. There's a lot of other different plugins without it. So the way those are going to be managed for the most part is through Helm catalog entries. And so, we have support built in for Helm. It's getting even better in the next, one of the betas in the next week or so. We're significantly enhancing it. But basically, for those ones is if you're installing a third-party driver, we're expecting to come through a Helm catalog or a Helm chart. So that will deploy the provisioner, and it might deploy a storage class, and then that storage class would show up in our UI or whatever. And then you could additionally add more storage classes and configure them. So there's a lot of different storage options. So we want to make sure out of the box, some of the ones we know that people use quite a bit, which are basically NFS, EFS, and EBS. Those are the ones that we see used the most. Those ones, we'll make sure that we have a good experience. Like right now, there's NFS support, but not through a storage class. But there is like an NFS provisioner in here, so we're looking at like packaging up the NFS provisioner to making that really easy. So there's a lot available to you because there's a lot available in the ecosystem. It might not be the easiest for you to figure out how to use, and that's why we're looking at basically packaging up, trying to get more of these storage solutions in Helm. So it's just more of a one-click type and install. All right.
There was another question on that. Someone said, when we create a volume with Gluster or Storage OS or Portworx, for example, are these deployed somewhere on the cluster itself, or do you have to set it up externally?
Well, so it all depends. So let's say like, let's see, Gluster volume or whatever. So for example, like when you set up a storage class for Gluster volumes, you put in basically, here's the API and all this stuff. So it's going to talk to Gluster. Where Gluster is running is up to you. You can deploy Gluster internally. You can, or you can set up a separate dedicated Gluster cluster or whatever. That's probably the sanest option. But so when you're doing this, like these things, even though like we have like these various different things like Storage OS, this is like just configuring access to it. Like it doesn't give you Storage OS. Like, so you still have to provide that. That's what I was saying, like why I'm demoing this on GKE is it works really easy on GKE because, they have their own storage solution and they set up a storage class for you and you don't have to do anything. But if you're running, let's say RKE and you wanted to use Gluster, you're going to have to deploy and manage Gluster. There's also storage in Kubernetes. There's two approaches. There's like manual, where you just go in there and you can just create volumes. You say, okay, I'm going to create a volume. And so like, this one's going to be an iSCSI volume, and I enter all this stuff. And this creates a volume that's available to a pod. And then a pod can use that volume. That's like a static approach. So there's that approach we don't really encourage as much, but it is definitely available. But it's not, it's like basically the users, like, someone as a cluster admin has to go in and create volumes for users. So storage class is the dynamic approach where storage classes will dynamically create volumes for users.
Darren, there was a question from Luke. He just said, "What about Longhorn? That can be built into Rancher 2.0?"
Yeah, we're making progress on it. So as I mentioned, there is right now Longhorn. Let's see. So you can set up the Longhorn storage class, but again, this won't actually deploy Longhorn. So we are looking at packaging up Longhorn as a Helm template. We had just a couple of weeks back, we had just announced. So we had taken Longhorn and we redid the control plane to run completely like Kubernetes native. So everything's like controllers and CRDs, custom resources. But right now Longhorn's using a FlexVol driver, which is hard to get working in some environments. So there's development going to switch Longhorn over to CSI, but we're making good progress on it, and we really hope Longhorn. So you're definitely going to see something. You're going to see kind of updates here and there throughout the year, and so we really hope that we get Longhorn as an option, just working out of the box.
Okay, I'll let you keep going. There's at least 50 to 150 questions that are unanswered. I apologize, everyone. I'm really trying to go as fast as I can, but there's so many good questions. It's hard to answer them all.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to, I just wanted to again touch on projects, just so people understand what projects are. So projects are largely a collection of namespaces. So this is when you start getting into, your end users of deploying applications is. You use projects as a way to group the namespaces and manage the policies. So you can basically set up RBAC policies for a project, and then users are allowed to create and delete namespaces as they want, and the policies automatically get applied to the namespaces. one of the main reasons why we created the project's concept was to simplify the kind of policy management, is because what we've seen is because of the way RBAC is done, kind of the implementation in Kubernetes is a lot of people lose the self-service nature of Kubernetes because they would have to go in, and in order to even get a namespace, they would have to go to a different group to set up the privileges. So they have a namespace, so they can use that. But namespaces are really quite useful from like a CI/CD perspective to be able to just create new namespaces. So we really wanted to make that self-service possible, and to kind of alleviate the management headache of that. And so that's why we introduced the concept of projects. The idea is it should be pretty non-intrusive because it's just a policy management concept. Like if you're just using kubectl or the Kubernetes API, you don't need to know anything about projects. You don't like projects is just your way of associating, RBAC policy, and eventually there'll be other like security or like pod security policies, for example, work through projects too. So it should be non-intrusive. The only thing is like if you want to create a namespace in a project to get like the policy assigned, when you create a namespace, you just have to put a label with the project ID on it. Otherwise, you're just going to create a namespace, and the namespace has no rules in it, no privileges. And if you don't have privileges to add privileges, then you just created an empty namespace you can't use. Okay. So hopefully we understand the concept of projects. So here I can go at the cluster level and I can say, okay, well, here's all my namespaces. And you can see the default namespace right now, we just automatically assign to the default project. But there are these other namespaces like kube system, a lot of Kubernetes system stuff. And then we have our own cattle system, which is the internal rancher, some of the things we deploy. So if you want, you can just assign, you can say, okay, well, this namespace, I'm just going to move that over to this project. And so it'll be visible in that project. We're not going to, well, I can do that here. So you can, I'll do that. So at least like when I go in, so if I go into the default project now, you can actually see, okay, here's the kube system namespace, and then here's all the stuff. This is stuff that Kubernetes deploys, got the event exporter, FluentD, some Heapster. These are various pods. I don't know what those do. But anyways, okay, so now once I get into basically deploying workloads, so at the top here we have these 5 options. Workloads. Workloads is kind of the kind of generic term, kind of bucket for replica sets and daemon sets and deployments and jobs, like just anything that your intention is to deploy a pod and scale it somehow. Like that's what workloads are. Then we have load balancing, which right now is largely just ingress. Service discovery, which is managing the services. So this is, basically setting up DNS names and pointing them to pods. Then we have volumes, which was some of the, I'll get into is that's some of the stuff I was showing. And the last one here is pipelines, and I'll do that the demo at the end. This is a feature that is specific to Rancher. But so when it comes to deploying workloads, so, we've gone through, pretty painstaking detail here of trying to add and cover all the various different options that are available to you when deploying things, but to try to do it in a way that you really don't have to have a huge amount of knowledge of Kubernetes of how things work. So here, I'll just give you an example, deploy Nginx. It's always a common example. So I'm going to deploy Nginx. I'm going to put it into this namespace. If I wanted to, I can add a new namespace. It would create it. It gets the, gets all the right policies and everything. But here we say, okay, I want to create, what type of workload do I want? The most common thing that people are doing is they're just creating what's called a deployment, which is I just deploy it and I want a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever. So that's kind of what we default here, but there are a lot more other options. You can say I want to run 1 pod on each node. This ends up being a daemon set. You want to create a stateful set. Now, stateful sets are like, you really have to kind of know what those are. It has to do with the way the volumes are managed. We're trying to figure out some way to explain this better to users. But if you want to create a stateful set, Or there's also if you want to create a cron job. So you can just run this pod, on this interval. So we're just going to go back and we're just, let's say we'll just deploy 3 of these. So then how do you want to expose this? So it's like once you've deployed this, how do you want to access this? And so this is Nginx. It's going to be running on container port 80 TCP, but I have various options of how I want to expose it. So one is I can expose this port on every single node on some random. This is what's called a node port. So this just basically gives you a random port. It's exposed on the nodes. You can access it. This is only the nodes that are running the pod. I can just bind it directly to the host. So this is host ports in Kubernetes. And this is very similar to the way Docker would work, is just say, okay, well, it's running on this host. I just want to expose it to this port. You can also say, okay, well, I actually don't want to expose it publicly. I just want to expose it internally through an internal cluster IP. And what we'll actually do here is we'll create a Kubernetes service for you. So it's just automatically set up. And the last option here is to set up a load balancer. So here it's going to use the cloud provider load balancer. And then it will be, however the cloud provider works. So I think I'm still in GKE. So this would end up creating a Google load balancer. And it would set up port 80 and it would end up load balancing to this application. Right now I'm just going to do, we can try load balancer. Why not? Okay. So environment variables, that's pretty straightforward. Node scheduling. So, so we have all of the various, rules of, this is basically, you can add multiple rules here, and you can say the nodes have to have all of these things. They require all of those. Or you have a different approach of, you can say it requires any of these rules. And this is, you would prefer it to have these things. So this is kind of like a hard scheduling. Like I have to have this label, like it has to go into the US West region or something like that. And then this one is preferred, which is, I'd like it to not be on the same host as this other thing. So there's quite a few rules and whatnot you can do there. Or there's just kind of there's the static scheduling if you can just say, okay, I just want to schedule it directly on a node. We're just going to let it do automatically scheduling. So health check, yeah.
Hey, Darren, before you move on from this page, I have a bunch of questions coming in about different things on load balancing and ingress and such. So, why don't you finish up? So we'll go through these sections, and then I'll come back and we can answer some questions.
Sure. Okay. So there's health checks. So Kubernetes has a concept of a readiness probe and a liveliness probe. By default, we just set them both to the same thing. But if you really wanted to, you can do two separate ones. But this is all your kind of your standard health check stuff: TCP, HTTP, or this is something we didn't have like on 1.6 is you can just run a command, which is really quite nice. Okay, so volumes. This is where it starts getting really interesting. So there's a lot of different options of how you want to create volumes. You can create an ephemeral volume, like that. Basically, this just gives you some space that's just for this container. When the container is deleted, the space is deleted too. You can create a new persistent volume, or we can use an existing one. So this one, we can try this. We can say, okay, my new volume. And this is before when I was talking about storage classes. You can say, well, use the default one, or use a specific one. So here I'm going to say, well, I want SSD, and I want this to be, 25 gig of space. And then there's some advanced options around how you do the access mode and whatnot. That's really important. Okay, so that will basically, so that's going to create a new volume for me. So when I deploy this, I'm going to get a new volume, and I'm going to, mount it here. And if you wanted to, you could put a subpath. That doesn't make sense for me because it's a brand new volume, but you could put a subpath inside of there. So that's if you want to use a brand new volume. You could use an existing one that might already exist. You can bind mount a directory from the host, and then the last one is you can use secrets. So secrets, I haven't added any, but if you go over here in secrets, I can add a secret. And then once I have that secret, I can say, okay, use it, choose the secret. Oh, these are just, we'll just try this. But basically what a secret will do is you can put the contents of the secrets at some directory in the host. It creates a tempfs, and then it puts the files there. So when your application starts up, it just has the files that have the secrets in it. I'm going to remove that. There's a lot of options on how you want to scale and whatnot. And then, so what I've covered so far is just kind of some of the regular options, but then there's more. There's networking, labels, a bunch of various security options. We'll cover all this stuff. Okay, let's see if we can actually create this. This is going to create a Google load balancer. Well, so it might take a little bit. We'll see.
Yeah, so there's just lots of questions. So I'll start with, one was just when you were showing the ports that were available, I think Sasha said can use ports greater than 31,000. Is that like a hard limit that's sort of baked in?
Well, because like once you get into the node port range, so like there's the node. I'm actually not sure what Kubernetes will do there, to be honest, because typically like when you do a host port, you're trying to bind to some like some well-known port. So you typically pick something that's like below the 10,000 range, but there is like the option of, but you could theoretically pick one of the ports that are in the node port range, which is 30,000 and above. There's a certain range. I don't know exactly. It's like 10,000 ports or something, but it's above 30,000. So it might be the Kubernetes might have a check to not let you do the host ports in the node port range. I don't know if there's a great use case for that though. So.
Another question was, are cron jobs, we talked about cron jobs, are they scheduled against the time zone of the rancher master, or is it the time zone they run in configurable somewhere, Misha was asking, or is it set up against the Kubernetes master? Like what's the time that's picking the cron job?
Yeah, the cron job is running against UTC time because there's no, like we run the containers with no time zone. I mean, so basically, typically, like our log entries and everything will be UTC, so it will run against UTC.
Okay.
Which is
another question.
Probably not that yeah, kind of confusing, I would say.
Another question that Slavomir asked. He said, "What about exposing Kubernetes deployment via ingress? It sounds natural to have that on your deploy workload page." But I think that must be somewhere else.
Yeah, it is over here in add ingress. The reason why it is not there, okay, so everything I'm showing here in the workloads, like, so this is in beta. We're basically feature complete, but we're definitely not like, this is not like 100% going to be the way the UI, like we're still tweaking things because like this period between beta and GA is super important, getting users feedback. People like it, don't like it, we will tweak things or whatever. And so load balancing is one that we kind of are fooling with. So ingress is over here in load balancing, but the only way to create a service right now is actually through the workload. So we'll probably add them both here. But the problem with ingress is that there's quite a bit more information. So it's kind of a little bit of an overload to do it at the time that you're deploying the workload. Because there's the path, if you're setting up TLS, the host. So, and this is just for like one sync, like you probably will have multiple paths. So it was too much to kind of shove in there. So like the service stuff, the other thing is that the ingress is layer 7 and the port stuff is all like layer 4 TCP UDP based stuff. So I doubt we're going to put the ingress into the workload one. If anything, we'll add service into the load balancing, but we're still playing with the UX. To be honest, in Kubernetes, like exposing things out through ingress and service load balancers, whatever, is it's kind of confusing. So we're trying to figure out what's the right balance here.
There's a couple other questions on this with, David had asked, where do you deploy on your own load balancer versus a cloud load balancer? And I think Max said, can you use traffic or HA proxy for ingress? Can you talk a little bit more about that, sort of importing different ingress controllers, managing different ones?
So for example, when you run GKE, I don't think GKE has an ingress controller by default. You actually have to deploy one. So I think when you do GKE by default, there is none. Like when you do, like when I deployed, so let's see, when I deployed something that's RKE based, like our Rancher distribution, let me just do custom. One of the options is what ingress provider. And so the only one we have right now is Nginx, but you can just say none, and then you can just deploy the catalog entry for traffic or whatever, so that you can then just deploy it after the fact. So you can definitely bring in more ingress controllers, like, because we're going to be doing some stuff around Istio and whatnot. That's brings in as custom ingress, and so you can add more. So right now, all it is out of the box, we provide Nginx for the RKE clusters, but I think all the cloud-based ones don't even have an ingress controller by default. Again, this was like some of the things that we're struggling to try to figure out how to make easy or whatever. Is it's quite difficult to figure out when I have a cluster, what's available to you in terms of, can you create a service load balancer? Can you create ingress rules? These things that are different between different clusters.
Okay. Keep going. Well, lots of questions, but just keep rolling. One thing I will say real quickly, guys, is just everyone knows, we're well over an hour and 20 minutes already. We're recording this, so just in case you don't know, there'll be a recording available to watch.
Okay. Right. Okay. So this, just looking at this. So basically, so when I was saying before, like we had selected the option to create a service load balancer. So if I go into service discovery, it's actually in here, you'll see, okay, well, we created this Nginx service. That's the cluster IP. It's pointing to this workload, which is the same thing as just, it created a selector, which selects the same thing as this workload. But you can just kind of see that relationship there between those two things. So we do our best. I was just looking at it, like there's like a bug here or whatever. So we try to get like one of the things is like you deploy an application in Kubernetes and then it's like, well, how do I access it? And it's like, well, okay, well, it's a pod. The pod is selected by a service. The service is pointed to by the ingress. So it's like, you have to jump through quite a few layers to figure out like what it's exposed as. And so we actually, we go through and we look at all the pods and services and endpoints and ingress and everything and try to make it as easy as possible for you to get to it. But I think with the service load balancer, there might be a bug because this link is not going anywhere. But anyway, so like, we try to make that as easy as possible to get to things. Let's see. So that was ingress service volumes. Okay, so that was the other thing I don't want to show you. So we had deployed that one. We got the service, but also I deployed a volume. So this created, so now in here I have my new volume, which is my volume, which is actually, the way volumes work in Kubernetes is you get what's called a persistent volume claim. It's like basically you're given access to a volume. So now in this namespace, I can use this volume, which is bound to this actual persistent volume. So if I go up to at the cluster level and I look at persistent volumes, you'll see now, okay, this one was created. So as users deploy more applications and are creating more volumes from a cluster level, you can see what are the volumes across, that are being used by everyone. Let me go back. Okay. And so if I wanted to, I could also just say, like, okay, well, let me just create a new volume here. So we'll just use the default. Capacity is required. 10. So this is So now this is just creating, it's in pending right now. It'll go to bound once once it's been actually has a persistent volume associated to it. So I've created this volume foo. It's associated with that, but this isn't actually being used by any container quite yet. So let me see if we show them. Yeah. So if I wanted to, I can go into workloads, say, okay, I want to deploy this. I want to use a volume, and I want to use an existing volume, and then this will give me an option to use that volume that I created. So we have the full volume management and all built in now, which is quite cool. Let me see the so service discovery. This is like just various ways to create services. Right now, the only way to create a service load balancer is through the workload UI, but we'll probably add it here. But services, for the most part, you're just creating a name that's available for your application, a DNS name. So I can just create this. I can point it to an external IP. So this is like great for something like, let's say, like you're doing like MySQL or whatever. Like in development, you might deploy a development, like a Docker container for MySQL, but in production, you want to use RDS. So instead, you just set up the record for MySQL to point to some external IP or maybe an external host name. Or here you can.
Darren, how would you use like an external DNS server? And there's lots of questions about this, like external DNS or different DNS services. How do you get the IP of the load balancer? How do you, do URL handling and sort of how do I expose my services in a better way? I think that's kind of the question a lot of people are asking.
Yeah. So right now, so we'll probably end up changing this label here because it's kind of confusing, because what we're managing here is internal DNS. It's cluster. It's inside the DNS, like the DNS inside the cluster, so that we can do service discovery. This is not external DNS. There is various external DNS plugins for Kubernetes that integrate with the clouds. So a lot of what you're going to end up seeing in Rancher is like catalog is going to end up being like a really important feature for us, because Kubernetes is so flexible and pluggable or whatnot is like you can add all these features just by deploying, some controller or whatever. So like the way the external DNS stuff works, like if I'm on AWS and when I create a service load balancer, I can put an annotation on it, which would be what the DNS name I want, and then the AWS DNS provider will then talk to Route 53 and then configure the Route 53 to point to that service load balancer. So all of these things are just deployed through just Helm charts. And so we're trying to iron out and get the catalog feature like really rock solid, really good user experience, because this is how we end up planning on bringing in a lot of this functionality. So, there's like a million things you can do with Kubernetes. The great thing is with Rancher, you can, we don't limit you. Like you can do anything you can with Kubernetes. There's a million things. They just might not be that easy or obvious to you. And so, we're doing our best to kind of cover all the basic use cases and the popular use cases and make those easier for users. And so,
you can imagine it's just continuing. I mean, if any of you used Cattle 1.0 versus Cattle 1.6, after 2 years of continuous improvement and experience, this stuff just gets better and better and better with investment and time. And as more people have great suggestions in the community, it's going to get better. I think there's a lot of things. I would say at least 10% of the questions that have come in are sort of, hey, there's this thing I really love about how things work in Cattle 1.6. Is that going to be available in 2.0? For the most part, the answer is, yes. Like we're trying to bring over most of the things, but there's a lot of stuff that, might either we might push off for a couple releases or we may, be working on getting it right. Darren, there are a lot of questions about, one question Frank said was, do you plan to use core DNS instead of kube DNS? Seems like that's the direction some people are going.
Correct.
So we kind of wrap up on DNS.
Yeah, I think the plan right now is we're going to switch to core DNS in Kubernetes 1.11. So we already started investigating that. I think in 1.10 it's kind of available, but then I think 111 is supposed to be the default. And so we're just basically following the kind of the community there. But yeah, I'm quite looking forward to core DNS, moving away from the kind of the DNS mask and all the stuff that's running right now, kubedns.
Darren, how do you get the IP of the load balancer? That was a question that a few people asked.
So the IP of the load balancer is typically, let's see, it's in the get service. Oh, okay. This is why it's not working. It's still pending. So there's some problem with the this GKE cluster. So typically, it shows up here, and so that's why, because I was saying in the UI I couldn't click on it. So for some reason it's pending. Describe service. Oh. There's an RBAC issue. So look at that. Yeah, so I mean, so basically that's where you get it, and it would pop up in our UI too, but it wasn't showing it. So that's why I tried going from kubectl to see what was going on. But typically, it would just put the cloud provider, which implements the service load balancer, just populates the IP.
Darren, I know we've covered a lot of this stuff, and it seems like we've probably bitten off more than we can chew as usual, but it's probably worthwhile to try and dive into the, kind of the CI stuff you wanted to show and some of the logging, and we'll wrap back around, guys. I know, sorry that we haven't answered all your questions. We'll dive into some of these as we go.
Yep. Okay. So, let's go. Okay. So I was going over the kind of the basic workload stuff. I think for the most part, I mean, kind of get an idea. We are still for sure tweaking the user experience, but most of the functionality is in there. But we're still, like a lot of the detail pages, we're still rounding out. Just little things that we're, just kind of polishing it as we head towards GA here. But I want to talk about, so there's these add-on features that we have coming in. There's three of them, which is alerts, logging, and then pipeline. So I will start with logging. So logging, basically what we have available, you can configure this at two levels. There's cluster and there's project level. So here at the cluster level, you can configure and you can say, what's my target? So under the hood, we're just using FluentD. We're just configuring FluentD. But we make it easy so you can say, okay, all the logging in the cluster, all my containers, I'm going to pipe to Elasticsearch or to Splunk, Kafka, or Syslog. So we have these four options here. And so by selecting it here, if I set up my Elasticsearch configuration, then cluster-wide everything is going to go to to this log target. And then I would go to Elasticsearch or one of these systems, and then I can see the logs. This is just grabbing the standard out and standard air of the containers. We also have an additional feature that will be available shortly that you can say also grab the logs in the directory of this container. So if you have an application that logs to local disk, not to like standard out or standard air, we can pick up the logs and ship those over to one of these log systems. So you can do that at the cluster level, and then the same available to you. I go to logging at the project level, so you can change at the project level where you want it to be pointed to. So I should have. Let me see. In order for this to work, you need to have some. So like if you're using Elasticsearch, you need to deploy Elasticsearch, which takes a good amount of memory. Let me see. Okay, here we go. So I have another one set up here. So I just want to kind of just give you an idea of, so here we have this cluster set up. If we go into this cluster, tools, logging, I have this set up for Elasticsearch. It's going to this Elasticsearch endpoint. And here's basically the Kibana running for it. So you can see it's shipped for the logs, all the logs. Like this is coming from the kubelet because we do run the kubelet in a container. But basically all your pods and everything will end up getting piped to the log system. And then it's just up to like the, magic you do in Kibana or Splunk or whatever to then select those things. Like when you set up the target, this kind of gives you an idea of what the record's being sent. So you can see, okay, it's sending these labels, the pod, the namespaces, and then you can add custom fields if you want. And so this is going to get all your logging over to your log system. Okay, so that's the kind of basic. So again, what we're doing under the hood is we're deploying and managing FluentD for you and automatically configuring it to go to various log backends.
You think that would work, Darren, with AWS Elasticsearch service? Lori was asking.
Yeah, it should, as long as I don't have any like odd. I haven't used it, but I imagine they just give you, credentials for it. But yeah, it should work. I wasn't aware that AWS had Elasticsearch. That's good to know. Okay. Okay, so that's the logging functionality. And then the next is alerts. So again, the way alerts work is there's two levels. It's at the cluster level and at a project level. So you can set up cluster specific alerts and project specific alerts. And what you can do at a project level and a cluster level is slightly different, because like at the cluster level, you can set up like node alerts or alerts for like if etcd's down, but that doesn't make sense to set in a project. So they're like slightly different. But then in order to get the alerts to work, you first have to set up a notifier. So the ones we have right now is just basically Slack, email, PagerDuty, or webhook. It'll just post to this generic webhook. Slack is, if you're using Slack, this one's pretty simple to set up. So once you have a notifier, then it's going to end up. So the way we're doing this under the hood is all the alerts are managed through the alert manager from Prometheus. So it's doing all the, kind of the alert aggregation, sending, rolling up, back off, and stuff like that, managing how often it bugs you. So if I go in here and say add alert, so there's various things of like, these are the different like component, like we have Kubernetes has this thing, component statuses. So you can watch the component statuses and say like, oh, if one of those components is going down. So then I say, oh, if the scheduler is unhealthy, then send a critical warning or info to this notifier, which would be like Slack. And then you can watch events. You can watch some of the node stuff. So you can say, okay, well, if the node's not ready, which means like if the node goes down, then send an alert. If the CPU is over a certain amount or the memory is over a certain amount, then send an alert. So you can kind of watch the resource usage of some of the nodes.
A couple of questions, Darren, on these things. So like the node, kind of the different type of alerting tools, as well as the different targets for logs. A lot of questions about can I add a new one? Like if there's something that's not exposed here, how hard would it be to create? For instance, I think Hussein said, can we add HipChat as an option? And someone else said, hey, could I pipe logs to Datadog's log collection service or something else? So what's the ability to add new things to these drivers that are already there?
Yeah, I mean, right now we don't have like an kind of like an external driver approach for these. It's basically it's contributing code, basically to Rancher itself. I'm trying to see if I can find the specific. Not totally sure where the code exactly is for alert. Watcher manager. So basically, right now it is basically you'd have to put in a PR to Rancher. I can't imagine it's very difficult to add these. But there's no external way to do it right now. It's just contributing code.
That seems like something that would be nice to have. So maybe we'll I think there's a number of areas where people have been asking these kinds of questions. Oh, can I add What about the IBM version of Kubernetes as a service? What about other node points? I think in all those places, we're trying to document approaches for how to add ones and how to make it easier. You should see those kind of expect blogs on all these topics over the next month or two as we sort of flush them out a bit more. And some of them were they've been refactored once or twice, or no, we're kind of finalized on a design that we like. You should see more of these kind of things.
Yeah,
but it's all meant to be pluggable, and obviously it's all open source.
Yeah, so right now, the way I just wanted to point this out, the way the clouds are working right now is it's through this other project we have. It's called Container Engine with a K. And the idea is the design of it is very similar to Docker Machine, where we just have a very simple driver interface to implement. And in theory, they can be packaged as like a third-party thing. We have a couple people working on it. So we have the AKS, like we have the 3 major clouds right now. But we have a couple people working on other clouds, some like external people. And so I imagine we're going to very quickly have to come up with a way to actually package these drivers. So they're not putting in PRs to Rancher directly. But this is something we already, like we had done with the machine drivers or node drivers in 1.6, and we still have the same approach. So if I, oops, not that one. Let me go back to this cluster. If I go up here to node drivers, these are fully, you can just add a new node driver and you put in the UI URL, where to get the actual binary. And that gives us all the drivers that we had from 1.6. But anyway, so we'll probably do the same thing for the cloud drivers. But yeah, we're definitely, we definitely didn't want to kind of over-engineer stuff or whatever. So as we see the need that, we're getting a lot of contributions in certain areas, we'll break it out so it becomes easier for people. Yeah.
Darren, there was a couple of questions. I've seen this multiple times, so I think there's maybe a little confusion on this one. I want to just bring it up that people have asked a couple of times, like, well, wait a minute, where does Rancher store its state? What happens if Rancher goes down? And then someone else had asked about, the database that backs Rancher. Maybe you can just talk about how we've moved to etcd for just a minute, because I think a lot of this is kind of relevant as you start thinking about, some of these services that are all being implemented by Rancher.
Yeah. So the architecture of Rancher is it's pretty neat because we leverage Kubernetes for a lot of things. So technically, like I touched on this a little bit in the very beginning, I was saying that what Rancher technically is just an application that runs on Kubernetes, as like Kubernetes controllers. So technically, the way it works is Rancher talks to Kubernetes and creates custom resources in Kubernetes and stores its state in Kubernetes. So there's 2 modes of how that works. Is if you do Docker run, you're running etcd inside that container, and we're actually running a fully embedded version of Kubernetes inside like the one process. So inside of, let's see, let me go show you. If I go into this container, ignore the defunct processes. So you can see in this container, basically we've got one Rancher process running. Inside of that is actually is running a full Kubernetes cluster in that one process, and it's running etcd. It's all embedded inside of that one process. And it's saving its state to varlib Rancher, like here on the disk, etcd. So it's saving its state to the local disk. So when you run Docker run, you are in fact actually running a tiny little Kubernetes cluster with etcd, and then Rancher running on top of it, and then it saves everything to varlib Rancher. So if you want to upgrade, you can just do volumes from, or before you even launch, just bind mount varlib Rancher to some place on disk, and that will save your state. So that's one approach. The other approach is you just deploy Rancher into a Kubernetes cluster. So for example, if like I have GKE, like I can just go to GKE and spin up a cluster. I can just deploy Rancher using just a Kubernetes manifest or, whatever, just create a deployment. If Rancher will recognize that it's running inside of Kubernetes, and then it will use that Kubernetes cluster to persist its state. So then its state will go into the cluster's etcd. So that's actually how we plan, like how we're ending up doing HA deployments. Is we're using RKE to set up a tiny Kubernetes cluster across 3 nodes that has like a full etcd and everything, and then we deploy Rancher as a deployment inside of there, and then it persists it into the etcd. So that might have been a little confusing. Maybe I should have shown some diagrams. I think in our last meetup we had some diagrams, some architecture diagrams of this. But the short of it is our state is stored in etcd. So in the Docker run, it's just in a directory. In an HA setup, which is coming soon, it will be in the etcd of the Kubernetes cluster.
Darren, there was a question, a couple questions. One was just asking about upgrading the beta releases. As people kind of move from one beta to the next, and they want to try and pull, get some of the bug fixes as you make a beta release. Is there any way? I mean, again, this isn't prod; they just want to try it out. Is there any way to upgrade their betas deployments without having to just blow it up?
Yeah. So if you're using the Docker container approach, so it's basically if I'm going to run a new, let's say like RC2 came out, then basically what you're going to do, stop the old container and then just say volumes from, and whatever the old container was, BA4 or whatever. And then that will start a new container using the state from the previous one. That's all you really need to do to upgrade. I'm going to put a caveat of like, it should work. We're doing our best to make this work. During the beta period, if we have to break upgrade, we're going to. It's more important we get the GA and the product right than it is to 100% make upgrades work right now. But I mean, in the past, what we've done like with Rancher 1.6 is, I mean, once we committed to like, we're supporting upgrades, we then can upgrade from any arbitrary version to any version. So we will, like, the upgrade should be pretty seamless and straightforward. And but right now we just put in a little caveat of like, if we have to break it, we will. But we have no intention right now. I know there's nothing in the pipeline right now of like, oh, that's going to break upgrades.
There's a question that Frank asked. He said, what will be the backup process for that etcd node in Rancher's own etcd instance? Like,
so if you're right, so if you're doing Docker run, the backup, I mean, the way we look at it is if you're doing like the Docker run approach, like that is, it's just a single node setup. So backup is basically like save the, persist the disk. You can technically like Docker exec into there and run etcd CTL commands. But we haven't really looked at a specific backup strategy for the single standalone container because it's like already not a very highly available setup. For the full HA one, what we're doing is we'll be running the CoreOS etcd backup operator. And so it will be backing up etcd, and then you can configure it to point to S3, Azure's, anything that's S3 compatible, Azure's object storage, and then we're adding an option to save to local disk. This is for people who do like NFS. They just mount an NFS backup to their control plane nodes, and then we back up to those directories. So there will be fully automated backups in the HA setup. The standalone, it's really just going to depend on users if they really, really want it. But we don't have plans right now to add like automated backups to the standalone Docker run container.
So there's at least 3 people asking the same question, Darren, which is something to the effect of Milos actually says, can I use Rancher to deploy Kubernetes cluster and then redeploy Rancher on that cluster to achieve HA and then just kind of disable the first rancher.
Well, yeah, so that's what I mean, but that's what our HA installer actually does. Is so it's a bootstrap that basically lays down an RKE cluster, puts Rancher in there, and then after that, it's actually like self-managing. Like it can actually upgrade itself if it wants to, which is kind of crazy. But like, I mean, we're still gonna have like the CLI approach, but we're actually, once we bootstrap the process, as long as you don't, like, your cluster doesn't go fully down, we can actually fully upgrade the cluster from itself, which is pretty crazy. But that's what I mean. But that's what our HA installer is going to do. It's going to be pretty sweet. Like I'm pretty excited to get the HA thing out, because it's just like, it sets up like a really nice, highly available, like everything is just kind of working. You get TLS and everything.
Okay, Darren, how are we doing on your demo? Is there more you want to cover before we start getting into the backlog of questions?
Well, there was still, I mean, we didn't cover, to go over alerts. Oh, I mean, the last one was basically pipeline, and pipelines is basically, I mean, but what we've seen is, there's a lot of great CI/CD products out there, and we work well with them. Like, they all have great integrations with Kubernetes. There's a lot of things we've seen. We're adding a feature to Rancher called pipelines. Oh, let's see. I don't have it enabled here. Let me turn it on. You have to go and enable it. Oh, well, okay. The way the pipeline feature works, how are we on I guess I'll go through this.
Okay, how are we doing on time? Yeah, we're a little long.
Yeah. Okay. Demo 42 or something. Okay. So in order to get the pipeline feature to work, because like we're doing integration with like webhooks from GitHub, is we first have to set up an application in GitHub. So for this one here, it just takes a second. We just need to paste in these secrets. Don't worry, this will be deleted after the demo. Okay, so then it authorizes this with, okay, so that basically, this turns it on, so I can now use the pipeline feature. And so the idea of the pipeline feature was that we wanted just because what we see is a lot of people's CI/CD requirements are actually quite simple. Like there's a GitHub trigger, they run some scripts, they run some Docker build stuff, push an image, and then run a deployment. And so we wanted to be able to pretty much cover these basic use cases. And so we've put in, so here, let me just, if I can just, so basically we've put in support for this. And this is, the pipeline stuff is a little bit a work in progress. There's some missing steps you'll see in here, but basically, so you can go, you'll clone this repo, you can do a specific branch. Sorry, this is like the triggers. So we get a trigger of, we're just watching that branch. We can watch everything except for a branch, or you can watch all branches. And then we get triggered if you, if there's a commit, if there's a PR, we'll be adding tag, or another option is just do this based off of a cron schedule. So here I'm just going to, so if I go and I create a pipeline, you can add various stages. You can have as many stages as you want, and then the stages can do whatever you want. Right now, this is very basic. We can run a script or do a Docker build and publish the image. But the idea is, with this feature is again, I was just saying, this is still kind of a work in progress. Is we really just wanted to target the very simple use case, because what we found is, like, with Docker files, and especially multi-stage builds, it's like it encompasses most of your build now. So it's like you can do quite a bit with a Docker file and then just push it. So it's like, once I have a GitHub hook, I do a push, maybe I run some custom scripts. Sorry, I run a Docker build, maybe I do some custom scripts, I push it, and then we just need to deploy it in Kubernetes. And so we just want to kind of build that very simple feature in. So under the hood, all we're really doing is we're deploying Jenkins and we're managing Jenkins. The nice things here is like we're deploying and managing Jenkins. We're keeping like the state of Jenkins. We kind of manage ourselves and back it up, and so it's effectively kind of like stateless. We do all that kind of for you. So like this just gives you CI/CD out of the box. It works very simple. We don't see this like replacing a full-fledged CI/CD product. There's a lot of great products out there, but this is like this kind of covers like the 80% use case. We've seen this a lot from especially like our open source users. They just really want something simple, and so that's what we're doing here. So there's a lot more to come on this. We're still tweaking the UX, adding some more functionality, but it should be pretty simple and straight to the point. Just basically clone, build, push, and deploy.
Okay. There's a lot of questions about will my pipelines work with GitLab and other types of Git repos besides GitHub?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, the intention is, yeah. Right now, we just added GitHub because I think we're really still flushing out the, kind of the end-to-end what this looks like. So we obviously just picked the most popular one, but we will add more triggers. GitLab is of course, so like right now we just support GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, but GitLab is a pretty popular one, and we'll probably just have a generic webhook based approach too.
So there's other questions like, like I think there was an obvious, Eugene just said, you're not like, if you have a CI process, you choose not to use this, everything else still works. It's not like this is tightly integrated and if you don't use this, everything breaks. Obviously, that's not the case. Yeah, it's like all the tools in Rancher. The whole idea of our tools, this new area we're calling tools, is we want to show really nice integrations to different tooling that can help you. But it's, again, this is a stack. It's Docker, it's Kubernetes, it's Rancher. You can stop at the point where Rancher builds your Kubernetes and configures it and sets up AD access. You can use it all the way through and be building software. We're working on CD. So, ideally you could be pushing code and having it roll right out. The idea is to not build another, big ungainly paths. That's not what we want to do. We just want to give you really good, simple use cases, ways to do things that are common so you don't waste time doing them repetitive tasks like figuring out how to get your logs out and setting up monitoring and alerts. But, for the most part, we're not trying to replace the awesome tools that already exist that do things really well, like GitLab or like Jenkins or anything. We're trying to sort of take common use cases and make them easy for people to consume.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to point out was that, all of these things, alerts, like the alerts, logging, and pipeline, those are kind of like the three add-ons we have right now. All of them are disabled by default. And we will continue to do that with everything we add forward because, like, for example, logging, like if you're doing logging and you're doing Elasticsearch, that takes a lot of resources and memory and whatnot. It's like we don't want to add more bloat to the product or whatever. So these things are disabled by default. You opt into them, don't have to use them. We definitely do see, we have customers of very complex requirements and whatnot, they're just not going to use these. Like they're not going to satisfy their demands. So they're going to go buy a third-party product, which is perfectly fine. And then we'll work great with that too.
Yeah, someone asked, why Jenkins? That seems heavy. Don't you guys use Drone? I've heard you talk about using Drone in the past. I remember having the same conversation.
I would like Drone, to be honest. I don't know exactly. To be honest, the reason I think we went with Jenkins is because it has a very good integration with Kubernetes. So the way that it works is we spin up the Jenkins master, and then when we submit jobs, Jenkins then calls back to Kubernetes, deploys a pod, which ends up being a worker slave, and then runs. So it had a pretty cool integration there to like better use the resources, whereas like the approach of Drone is really more like setting up static build slaves, which I very well could be wrong there, but like I know that's the way we run Drone because we do like all of our stuff is on Drone, and I like Drone. I do like it quite a bit. So I don't know. I think there was some talk of like maybe we can just redo it in Drone. But that's kind of the idea. The kind of the idea of what we're doing with like the pipeline or whatever. It's like it's very simple. It's very high level. Like it is powered by Jenkins, but we have no intention. Like people have asked, like, oh, can I use this Jenkins plugin or that? And it's like no. Like that's not not the purpose. Like we're not like if you want Jenkins, deploy Jenkins and use it. This is like we just needed an engine to kind of do these things for us. So it like has the GitHub webhook integration already there. You know, it dynamically will spin up resources and use them for Kubernetes. So there's some nice things, but it is too fat. I will agree.
A couple of people had said you might want to look at Jenkins X, which is set of Jenkins for Kubernetes. There's some tooling out there called Jenkins X. So thanks, George, for that. Okay, Darren, we have lots of questions. You've covered tons in this demo. Was there anything else you wanted to wrap up in the demo before we sort of kind of talk next steps and then try to answer some of these questions?
No, I think that's mostly it.
Okay, awesome. Well, under 2 hours for at least getting through the demo.
Thanks. That fifth node did finally come in.
Maybe it's a first. Okay, so I am going to just take back the presenter ball for just a minute because I do want to go through a few things on the slides, and then we will dive into these questions. So feel free to keep asking your questions, and if you want to sort of ask your questions in a way that references back a little bit more to the area of the conversation, that might help me know what you're asking about as we go through them and try to work through it. So just if you haven't already figured this out, getting started with Rancher is pretty easy. You can go to our website. There's links right there on the homepage that say deploy Rancher. But it's not a SaaS. It's software. You need to set up a Linux host. You need to make sure it's running a pretty recent version of Docker and has, ideally Ubuntu or something on it that we've tested. And then you start the Rancher server. And this will give you at least the beginning point for Rancher. The docs are very much still a work in progress on 2.0. Lots of things are still changing up until sort of the beta release. So now that we've locked stuff down, our doc writers are hard at work, improving the docs. You'll see them get better and better over the next month. But if you're running into issues, don't be shy. The beta program is really meant to give people a place to put feedback out there and try, when you're trying stuff and it's not working, we really want to incorporate your feedback. So use issues on GitHub, use the Slack channel, use the forums. We have people on all those things monitoring them. If you haven't actually joined the beta, you can go to info.rancher.com/rancher2-beta. You can also find this on our homepage. It basically just gives you access to some special forum things. It makes sure that you get all the news about what's going on with the beta, and it gives you a way to contact us. Like, hey, welcome to the beta. If you're using the product, here's an email. Call, hit us up if you're hitting a problem. If you think there's something you need to improve. We also have been started sending out these cool cows to people that are our little beta gifts. So thanks for doing it. They're, you can make your own little cow herd. So people who are answering other people's questions in the forums are the first people getting it. People who are submitting issues are the first people getting them. So, kind of please don't hesitate to get involved. The docs are here. If you just go to rancher.com/docs, the quick start guide gives you the big basics for getting your system set up. I think the HA docs are still coming, so you probably start with a simple deployment to test things out. If you haven't already, go to GitHub for posting your issues. You can get involved there very easily. There are lots of opportunities to help as well. So if anyone wants to contribute, please fire away and ask for that. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up the main session and turn the ball back over to you, Darren, so we can dive into the Q&A in a little bit more detail. Sound good? I think you're still muted, buddy.
Yeah, I'm muted. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to try to, if you've left, your question is moot. So I'm starting with people. Who are still here. So I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning a little bit, guys. There was a question, almost 2 hours ago that David asked. He said, "Is there support for Let's Encrypt wildcard certs?"
I do not believe so. I have to look into that. I added the Acme support. I mean, it's based off of what's in Go. Like the Go has a pretty standard Acme package, but it has not been updated. So since they released wildcards, so I can't imagine it works with wildcards. That would be, if you want to put it in issue, would track that, because I would like that.
Awesome. How about this? Next question was from Rich. He says, we currently have Nginx in front of Rancher server performing SSL termination. Will this no longer be needed for Rancher 2.0?
It's not needed. I mean, so basically what we found so the approach we took with Rancher 1.6 was we were just always HTTP, and it was kind of up to the user to provide SSL. That caused a lot of problems for users. SSL kind of stinks. So we wanted to make it in 2.0 that it is built in. So we can just do the SSL for you. So we can do Let's Encrypt, self-signed, which is not great. Or you can just provide your own certificates. But you still can front it with your own SSL termination if you want to. So that still does work. It's just not required. But there are definitely situations and organizations where they basically have to run that way because the cert is managed by a different team, or it's in, IAM or something like that. So there's definitely there's a reason for those use cases or whatever. So hopefully getting SSL should be easier now.
Awesome. Another question. This one was one I'm sure near to your heart. It's someone said, I'll continue to bother you on ARM deployments. Kubernetes is natively compatible with ARM v8 64-bit platform. Why doesn't Rancher allow me to deploy IoT things like multiple Raspberries? Can you talk about this? I know it's an area you care about too.
I do care about it. Not enough people care about it though. I very, very, very much want ARM 64 support. It's just a matter of the thing that is currently blocking us it's not blocking us. It's the effort that needs to be done is to make all of our images multi-arc, which we need to switch over to a method of doing the manifestless and whatnot. So it is still not like the simplest thing from so for example, like all of our releases and everything are completely automated. Like you just tag it and then Drone does everything. It pushes it and everything. So we have to figure out how to do manifestless. So that's kind of where we're stuck right now. Otherwise, and we don't want to have an approach where we like build, the problem is we use a lot of images, and so we can't like change the image name based off the architecture. We really do need multi-arc support because it's too much of a pain to manage it. So I really hope it gets there for GA. I have so many ARM devices. If you ever followed me on Twitter, I have a problem with buying ARM devices. So I want it to work.
Okay. There was a question like, can I run into trouble when installing Rancher 2 on Debian, Jesse or Stretch? Any concerns about Debian specifically, Darren?
No, not really. It should be fine. Again, it's just really the Docker version. I mean, go with like Docker 112 or 1703. You should be fine. We run, because the thing is we run everything in containers. So we just like the kubelet, all the Kubernetes components, everything's in a container. So we actually bring a lot of the user space stuff ourselves. I'm trying to think, because we've had some weird issues with Red Hat and the way they set up their C groups, but not typically on Debian. Like boot to Docker is very odd. We're currently adding support for boot to Docker. But
awesome. So here's another question. Slavomir asked, it would be a nice feature for auto-scaling Kubernetes resources, like defined policies, which would trigger Kubernetes deployment, stateful sets, scaling based on alarms, metrics. I'm not sure if 110 has something like this, but I know, Darren, between Prometheus and Heapster, there's a number of different things that can do some level of auto-scaling. We talked about it a little bit from an infrastructure perspective, but if you're looking at auto-scaling like the Kubernetes pods and sets, services. Any best practices there? Anything you're thinking about from the user experience that we might expose?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the horizontal pod autoscaler. So in we were talking about, like, in the 2.1 is one of the, so right now, like, our alerts and everything are based off of nothing's based off of metrics right now, because we're not actually deploying and managing something like Prometheus. But in 2.1, we're trying to get to that point. And when we have Prometheus, then we have a metrics collection system, and then we can better make like the horizontal pod autoscaler work out of the box, because it's based off of like the various metrics. So today, like in 2.0, you can do it all yourself. You can bring it all in. You can run it. We do hope in next versions that we can make it a lot easier for users to do that. So that's like a 2.1 timeframe type thing.
Here's a good question, and it's one that I wish we could have talked about a little bit more, because we always do these demos. We're always spending most of the demo in the UI, but the reality is most people who use Rancher at scale and stuff, they end up using it all through CLI and API and other things. So David asked a question. He says, is there going to be a notion of templates to handle projects consistently? But I think you could apply the same question as, is there going to be a notion of templates to handle clusters consistently? And it's great to do this to kind of understand the options, but once I've sort of configured it, I don't want to have to re-put in all this crap over and over again. I want to be able to just launch from code or launch from API. So I think, David, hopefully that's part of your question, is beyond just projects, but can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in the UI here, we have download links for this CLI. So what we have coming in the CLI is specifically, there's two things that you'll care about here. It is inspect and up. So inspect, so the approach of what we're doing is the CLI is covers all the Rancher specific stuff, setting up clusters, setting up authentication, deploying nodes, all the Rancher specific stuff. And then the CLI will also, you can say like Rancher kubectl, and it will just automatically download configure kubectl for you. And then you can run kubectl and do whatever the heck you want in Kubernetes. So for all of the Rancher managed resources, things that are not, Kubernetes, like a pod or a deployment, we're adding, basically you can run inspect and up. Inspect is basically, it's like Docker inspect or export for the most part. So if you go and you deploy a cluster, then you run inspect, you can, okay, this is what my cluster looks like. It's a YAML or JSON format. You can save that to a file, and then you can later run up, and then it'll do it again. So everything in Rancher will be, you can just do it from a command, similar to kubectl apply. It's going to be a similar thing, or Docker compose up. So it's like everything in Rancher can be managed through a configuration file. So that is definitely coming. So one of the, so where you're gonna see the kind of the most amount of change over the next couple of weeks in Rancher, because for the most part, we're pretty much done with all the features and whatnot. We're just fine tuning things. It is still like catalog and YAML type stuff. Like what I didn't show in there is like import or export YAML, edit YAML. Like there's a, you click on a deployment, and instead of going through our UI, you just want to edit the YAML directly. All of that kind of like file based approach, all of that is still coming. So we've gotten this request over and over again. We know it's important, and it will be there.
So one thing we skipped, and we were going to talk about it, and I think we decided it was just going to be too long. It would probably, even for us, go longer, was to look at Helm and talk about the catalog.
Right.
Do you want to, just briefly, since it could be another, we don't want to do that, but there are a lot of people saying, can I add a private Helm catalog? Where, how do I use the catalog? This will be a topic maybe of our next meetup. We're working on a May meetup. We may just do the whole thing on catalog and sort of, more things in that nature. But do you want to just touch on it really briefly, Darren?
Yeah. And so the approach is so basically what we've done is, catalog in 1.6 is a huge feature. People love it. So we want to keep basically the same experience as what we had in 1.6, but we're basically moving over to everything being a Helm chart. So we have complete compatibility with anything, like with any Helm chart. But the way Helm works, in order to get everything to work with like RBAC and security and stuff like that, what we're doing is we're actually managing the deployment of the charts ourselves. So we don't have like everything's going to be based off of Helm, but as a user, you're not going to be running Helm install, Helm upgrade, whatever. It's going to be, the management of it is going to be Rancher specific, but the chart is standard. And so you like what we have in the app right now, it's disabled by default because we know there's some issues. But the catalogs, there's the Helm stable and Helm incubator. You can enable those and they'll show up in the catalog. You probably don't want to do that in this release. You might want to wait for beta 4. So we take all the catalog entries that are just already available out there in the community. They should all work fine in Rancher. We're actually going through and kind of curating a set, making them a little more tailored so they work a little better. If anyone's used Helm, a lot of times there's like 400 questions, and they're not exactly sometimes the easiest things to use. So we really should have top notch. So it's like you're going to be able to just take any old Helm template, you can install it, upgrade it, roll back, see the various versions, see like once you installed it, what are all the resources that were created by the Helm template, what's the status of that application as a whole. So there's really quite a bit. Like I think it does make sense. Like we could probably do a meetup around just catalog and managing things with text files.
Yeah, I think that's a CNI based meetup, and this stuff would, not CNI, CLI based meetup would definitely be useful. Okay, yeah. Some questions that came in a while ago was more so our volume. There was a lot of questions about volumes and stuff. So Stefan said, are volumes deployed to a cluster or are they deployed to a stack / namespace? We want our users to see only their own volumes. So if I run a storage service, how does a user actually get access to it?
Right. So that's why they have this, Kubernetes has this distinction of like, there's volumes are technically created at a cluster level, but as soon as a volume is used, it's basically associated to a namespace, which is very similar to a stack in 1.6. So what you can do is you can set up a user such that they do not have privileges to see, let's go to the GK one. They would not have privileges to see persistent volumes at a global level. They instead would have to go to a project and they can click on volumes here, and then they would only see volumes which have been granted to them. So this creates the volume and it assigns it. So this volume, while technically is created at the cluster level, is now assigned to this namespace. So you would only see that. So a user, the intention is that a regular user should not be going up here and fooling with this type of stuff. That's like administrative type things. They should just go in here and it's a fairly abstracted thing where they just say, give me the type. There's not like really options. It's give me the type and size. Kubernetes has these other, oh wait, sorry. No, that's not what I want. Yeah. So in terms of like kind of locking down the users or abstracting away from storage and whatnot, it's a pretty decent model, and it ends up working out pretty well once you put all the proper RBAC in place.
Okay. This is Gregory says, are operators managed by Rancher? If I read an operator to deploy or manage a workload, will it integrate correctly with Rancher?
Yeah, the operator, all an operator is, it's just a pod that is running with a service account. And so you would basically deploy it, and then it depends on how you want to manage it. Like you can actually manage the service account RBAC through the project, or you can actually have when you deploy it, just set up like custom one-off RBAC rules so the service account is set up properly. But there's really nothing special about an operator. It's just code that talks to Kubernetes with a service account.
Thanks. How do you make I think we talked about making the server configuration in Rancher persistent, but one of the questions I saw a lot of people ask about was, the networking model. In Rancher 1.6, obviously we had encrypted networking. In 2.0, we don't have that as a default option. Do you want to just talk about, kind of networking between environments, overlay networks, encryption, what's available? Maybe that'll answer some of these questions. There's a handful of questions on that.
Yeah, so what we have right now is, if you're getting it Kubernetes from your cloud, then it's going to be based off of the cloud. If you're deploying RKE, we'll give you 3 options: Flannel, Calico, and Canal. So Flannel is basically a VXLAN-based networking. It's overlay. Calico is using BGP and routes. It's not overlay. Calico is it's very, very good, but it doesn't necessarily work everywhere. So we do default to a Flannel backend. This is where it gets kind of confusing. There's this third option, Canal. What Canal is it's actually Flannel plus parts of Calico for policy management. So we default to Canal. So we're using Flannel, which is VXLAN overlay networking. Then we get policy management from Calico so that we can enforce Kubernetes network policies. So by default, what we do is when you create a project, we set up a network policy that allows everything in that project to talk to each other. But if somebody creates another project, it can't talk to the other project. So by default, right now, all the projects have isolated networking. They can't communicate across projects. But within a project, you can do as much communication as you want. We'll add more configuration around network policy and what you can do. Saying like project A can talk to project B. It's possible if you want today. If you don't want any of that network policy enforcement, just select the Flannel option. Now, regarding encrypted networking, IPsec has just recently been merged into Flannel. We have, obviously a lot of experience in running IPsec networking. If users, want that option, we'll definitely, support it. So that's just kind of based up to demand. So like right now, for whatever reason, encrypted networking is not very common or in the Kubernetes world. And so we'll kind of see if people start requesting it, and if so, then we'll bring it back.
So a lot of people had questions about IPsec. I think Adrian was saying, yeah, I'd love to see IPsec back. David suggested WireGuard would be nice. Over IPsec is another thing to think about. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say about the IPsec is the way that IPsec is done in Kubernetes is actually really quite nice. It will work. It will be much more reliable than what we have in 1.6. So what we have in 1.6 at this point, the IPsec is pretty darn reliable. We've ironed out a lot of the issues and whatnot, but like the way that we have done IPsec in 1.6 is we're basically creating a kind of a virtual L2 over an L3 technology, and it's very dynamic, and it's quite interesting what we did. The approach of how it's done in Kubernetes is it's very static. Which means there's a lot less moving parts, and it's more likely you're less likely to run into issues. So I like the simplicity of how it's done in Kubernetes.
Got it. So there was a question about different types of kind of, let me see if I can read this right. Any plans in the future to provide more insight into Kubernetes networking, a la something like WeaveScope? Maybe not as advanced as WeaveScope, but would be great to have some visibility. And there's no UI for Canal, Flannel, Calico, etc. Do you want to maybe talk about that?
Yeah, we don't have anything particularly kind of on the roadmap there for like I would say like the networking aspect. I mean, we are very much looking at like service mesh and kind of the layer 7 type HTTP metrics and pulling together nice graphs and information there. We don't really have anything on the roadmap for kind of network visibility. Yeah.
I think right now, I mean, it's in the catalog. You can deploy Weave Scope. It's there. I think from a service mesh perspective, we've always wanted to be able to really define, show how traffic was going on, how traffic was happening, and be able to kind of implement that. But again, we kind of have to be careful about biting off too much here. Weave Scope's a great product. It's really well implemented. You can set it up and with a click from the catalog. It's already Kubernetes aware. It's a pretty good solution for that type of network visualization. So like, just kind of rolling up to your question. I know you were going to demo the catalog a little bit, and you sort of went through that briefly. There were some questions on here. I'm just kind of pulling this up. Hussein had asked earlier. He said, "When you're in the pipeline, can we add stages to the pipeline?" Can you answer that quickly?
Yeah, I mean, so there's basically in the pipeline. Do I have that here? There's basically just select only random thing. There's basically you have stages which go like linearly, and then within there you have steps. So I can add multiple steps, and steps run in parallel. So each one of these things, it does not block the other one. So you can add more. Like we just kind of populate this default. That's what you'd want to do, but you can actually just delete the whole thing. The other thing is, let me see. Let's call it something. Add. Once you have a pipeline, you can export this config. Oops. Let's just view it. You can get the YAML for it. You can also import. You can put these into Git. Yeah, so there's quite a bit you can do to manage it.
Well, guys, I think as much as I'd love to answer all of the questions, I think we're going to have to wrap up. We're going to have to get moving. I've got to jump in the car and drive somewhere. So, everyone who attended today, I know this was great from our side to get so much feedback. If we didn't answer your question, we'll try to get back to you, and we'll certainly, we'll both be on Twitter afterwards. If you want to fire us more questions, anytime, we're always happy to take the questions. But for I can't believe there's still hundreds of people here. So for all of you who are still here, thanks a lot for sticking it out, and we really appreciate all of your support as we're building out Rancher 2.0. Darren, as always, thank you so much for doing the demos.
All right.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.